This is number 3 in the participation series. Well, I said that only postgraduates should do this, and all postgraduates should do this. Why is this? Why not everybody else too? Well, the first reason, the first of two, is that graduate students or intending graduate students formulate the idea for their PhD thesis toward the beginning of their 3rd year of undergraduate study. They are naive. I was. Everyone will be at that stage in their career. They haven't been trained to actually do research. They've probably been given a lecture course on methods, normally delivered by someone who's never done any research either, but has been the person who answered the call, echoes down the corridors of all universities in early September every year. Who's going to teach the methods course this year? Well, as Evans Pritchard put it somewhere else, and I quote, "Everybody who is not a complete idiot can do field work." So the real reason is that PhD students can't do any other sort of research. Oh, they'll learn a lot by doing participation in the process of writing it up. They'll learn a lot of the trade. But they have to learn how to do things. They have to walk before they can run. And participation study is the walking bit. Sociology deserves this sort of attention to the world. It has a mandate, I think. Sociology at the sharp end should always be sliding its inquiring hand up the skirts of every social enterprise, finding out what's going on. It's impossible to fund it otherwise. I wrote a long paper in 1981 with a colleague from Durham University, Robin Williams, looking at why it was the ESRC doesn't, and probably cannot, fund totally open-ended, deep, deceitful participant work. The tradition of the ESRC has always been, even when it was SSRC, it was conservatism and quantitative studies, and to be immersed, quite honestly, in the verification epistemology. It's difficult at the practical level with ESRC if you're applying for a research grant. Practically all the substantial sections in the application form ask you things that could only be satisfied with a positivist rather than ethnographic or inductivist attack on the data of the real world. When you have huge sections that say things like, please outline the hypothesis you're going to test. Another one says, specify the nature of the sample you're going to test your hypotheses on. Give an indication of time schemes. All the meat and drink to verification analysis and positivism, but the anathema of good ethnographic work, which shouldn't be able to answer any of these questions at the outset. We never have time, those of us that have crawled up one rung of the ladder from being a postgraduate student to one of the few research jobs or lectureships that are going, although I think that logjam will free itself up more in the future. Why not all postgraduates taking a route which is guaranteed to generate fame for themselves and respect for sociology? I had one student, for example, I forget what she wanted to do originally, but when so persuaded by me, and the only empirical thing I ever made my graduate students do was to learn to touch type to a high degree of fluency in the first 2 weeks of graduate study. Then they were on their own. This woman, I don't remember what she intended to do to start with, but she ended up living with, effectively, a group of young and not so young female drug injectors in Glasgow. A difficult job, one to which she had to be inoculated against various likely problems like hepatitis C, so on, to continue her work. Her Her resulting work, Women Drug Users, was an astonishing tour de force. She wanted to call it Needlework, by the way, which I thought was a wonderful title. The publishers insisted on otherwise. Another student of mine, again I forget what he started off doing, but he was heavily into pot growing. So he turned his attention to something he knew about. Getting into the field is the key thing. Use the contacts and so forth that you already have. Everyone's got contacts somewhere. He used his contacts in the field and produced a masterful dissertation. He's now a senior lecturer. The woman I referred to is now a professor, of course. He's become the expert on pot farming, commercial pot farming in the UK. Only a couple of weeks ago was referred to most respectfully in The Economist magazine. This long report I wrote with Robin Williams about the ESRC, unfairly I now believe, although maybe I now believe it because I'm getting soft with age or infirmity, I blamed on the ESRC. I now think that's quite wrong. I think the positioning graduate PhD students in participation study for their graduate study should be the responsibility of universities' sociology departments. That's the first step for graduates. After which, of course, you may want to have an influence on policy, just endlessly producing ground level, although empirically valuable and novel and extraordinarily readable work, as ethnography always does. It's so much more readable than looking at tables and numbers, perhaps too indulgently so on some occasions, perhaps. You might want to do things that affect policy, or you might be confronted, as I was, by the world thrusting itself in upon you with emergent local dire social problems that certainly needed a view from someone qualified and prepared to look at them in detail. It hit me in 1981. At that point, I was more concerned, I think, with talking to colleagues on the west coast of America, although I was living in Glasgow and had been there for nearly 3 years. I disdained, as did many, the idea of working on local social problems until the heroin crisis hit Glasgow in 1981. Overwhelmed Glasgow's services. No one was doing anything about it. So we did a very short piece of work, very quick piece of work, funded for less than £1,000, as a matter of fact, by the Scottish office, where we tried to pull together all the strands. There wasn't much participation involved in it. There was a little. We tried to talk to some of the young junkies in Glasgow and get their words on the page, and I've always done that ever since, whatever piece of work I've been doing. I always had questionnaires annotated by the odd things that people say, so I can build it into the text later when I'm reporting. This problem overwhelmed Glasgow. And unfortunately, if you want to affect policy, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to affect it by qualitative data and induced ethnographic analysis alone. Everybody demands numbers. Of course, there's a slick way out of the number trap. I mentioned for the first couple of 3 years in Glasgow, I was more in touch with colleagues on the west coast of America than I was anybody in Scotland. This was to change. And in that period, I remember I had written an obituary of Donald Roy, the great Donald Roy, as a matter of fact, in a journal called Urban Life and Culture, which later became, I think, pretentiously renamed as the Journal of Ethnography. And because of that, I was recruited instantly onto their board, on which I didn't do an awful lot. But I remember once being summoned, if summoned is the right word, to an editorial board meeting in California, and I went with some alacrity because it gave me the chance to meet other charming people of the labelling and interactive school of deviance in California. We had a desultory meeting in the office of the chair of the board, who was Peter Manning, the great police researcher. And thereafter we repaired to a rather fine Californian Chinese restaurant. And we had our meal, which was very pleasant, and lots of chat. And then at the end of the meal, this rather long and rather long and pungent cigarette was passed round, the board members, of whom there were about 10, I think. And after a long silence, someone said to Peter, "How's it going with the publisher, Peter?" There was another long silence, and Peter said, "Well, he's wavering a bit." And we all went, after a suitable pause, "Oh dear, what are we going to do about that? What did he say, Peter?" And there was another very long pause, and Peter said, he was worried about the lack of quantitative data. This is the bear trap into which many of these initiatives eventually fall. So there was another, this time even more dubious and doubtful pause. And someone said, "What did you tell him, Peter?" There was another very, very long pause. Peter said, "I told him there was a number on every page." That's a slick way out. I did the work on heroin with some colleagues, did the work on heroin in 1981, and it got the ball rolling in some unattributable way, and studies began to mount up, concern began to be raised. But I think we opened the door, if only marginally, to that concern. Sometime in 1983, a couple of years later, I was sitting in my office in Glasgow, as you do when you're no longer doing active participant work, sitting in my office in Glasgow, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was a plummy English woman's voice saying, "I have Lord Rothschild for you." Promptly there was a silence. Then a very gruff voice came on the phone and said, "Ditton?" So I said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "Huh. I'm reading your heroin report. I'm on page 4. What does the word referral mean?" So, sharp as a tick, which is unusual for me, I said, "Past participle of the verb to refer, my lord." There was another grunt at the other end, and he hung up. Somewhat later, he was on page 33, I think, and he rang up with another query. I forget what it was, but I couldn't help thinking at the time, that's magnificent. If you're a lord, you don't have to actually look at a dictionary. If you've got a problem with a word, not that referral is a particularly difficult one to get your head round, I would have thought, you ring up the author, or rather you have your secretary ring up the author. It's wonderful. Wonderful being a lord. It's a feature of the House of Lords that I hadn't encountered before or since. Now, this didn't have a great effect, or had some effect, I think, some marginal initial effect on the heroin problem. But in 1984, Rothschild reported on the state of the SSRC, the Social Science Research Council, as then was. His task, according to most biographers and commentators at the time, was to axe the SSRC, but he didn't. He recommended a few changes, among them being changing the name from SSRC to ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, but nothing significant to everyone's surprise. When I got hold of the Rothschild report, the frontispiece to the report, the whole page, and it was the only piece of social science work referred to in his whole document, his whole report on SSRC as then was. The frontispiece, the whole page, was a replication of the hand-drawn graph that I'd had to use in my hurry to get the report finished, showing the rise in the number of new heroin addicts in Glasgow in the early part of 1981. I think the previous 10, 15 years it had been something between 2 to 5, 6, 7 new users each year. And the number rose and fell until we hit the first 6 months, and the graph of numbers of new users zoomed upwards almost vertically. I thought this was, to even an impartial observer, some credit, albeit unintentional, given to the work we'd done. That's the end of segment 3 of the participant series.